We're going to try this experiment. So Andrew is going to. Oh no, because we need to record you and then we'll put it. Andrew, this is Andrew Saunders, and he also works for NDCIS, and he's going to introduce Olivia and Eve.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to everyone online from around New Zealand and those who obviously are here in person. Great turnout. The winter lectures are a partnership between New Zealand Christians in Science and the Maclaurin Chapel on themes of broad interest in the areas of overlap of science, culture and faith. This year, our theme is faith and anxiety. And we've got a couple more lectures coming up. There's a panel next week on which both Nicola and I are participating, but also a counsellor and a church leader, not-for-profit leader, and a couple of others will be contributing as well. And then in a couple of weeks' time, not actually held here, but held at St Andrew's Church, 2 Simon Street, we've got Ashley Bloomfield coming along to speak on faith and anxiety in an age of pandemic. Now for that one, you actually have to enter online, and there's about 200 people already who have signed up. So if you haven't yet, you need to, because they'll be cut off soon. As usual, we really do want to thank our sponsors, which are the Wilberforce Foundation, Maclaurin Chapel, and the World Templeton Foundation for their generous support, in particular in support of New Zealand Christians in Science. Tonight, Olivia will be speaking on decentering the Eurocentric self, community and Pacific perspectives on psychological well-being in the context of climate change. Now, Olivia has been with us before at the chapel presenting in recent years. Currently, she's a PhD student in the Department of Psychology. Olivia, a very warm welcome to you, and we'll just begin with a prayer. Oops. Thanks. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come and hear about this fantastic topic and the perspectives of our Pacific neighbours and others, Lord. We pray for Olivia, who's had a bit of a cold. We pray that you enable her to speak clearly and be with her during this presentation, and all of us, of course. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you for that. Would you mind turning around the camera just so I can quickly say hello to the room, if possible? I see 2 lovely faces.
Sorry, we've lost something. Yeah. Oh dear.
That's all right. If it's too much of a hassle, we can just go without it.
So we're not really lost. Okay. Okay, you go hold on that way. There. I don't know if you can see anything, can you?
Yes, I can. Oh, great. Kia ora, everybody.
Kia ora.
Can everybody hear Olivia? Okay.
Ka pai. Well, I guess I'll get started then. So kia ora koutou. Tēnei te mihi kia koutou, kua piri mai I tēnei pō, tinana, ipurangi rānei, he mahana te ngākau ki te kite I a koutou, ki te kōrero I wainga nui I a koutou katoa. He mihi tuatahi ki ngati whātua ki orake, raua ko ngā kaiwhakahaere o te hui nei. So thank you everybody for coming today, and big apologies for the change that I'm not able to be there in person. As you can probably hear from my voice, I've got a little bit of a cold going on. And as we are in the time of COVID, it's best that I stay home. So apologies in advance if at some point I need to cough or sneeze. It's not there for added effect. It's just the fact that I am sick. Cool. Yes, so as Andrew mentioned, my name's Olivia Yates, and I'm a Balangi PhD candidate based at the University of Auckland within the School of Psychology. So today's talk will be about decentering the Eurocentric, community and Pacific perspectives on well-being in the era of climate change. And you'll note the title that was read out earlier is somewhat different to what I've got on the screen. Content's the same. I was just dissatisfied with the original wording. So this topic came about in discussion with Nicola a few months back about how we don't really see the diversity of different scientific approaches and reflected in the public sphere. And as someone who works with Pacific methodologies within the discipline of science, I offered to contribute a few thoughts. But I wouldn't have expected this kōrero to become quite so timely. So as many of you have undoubtedly heard, Our university has been caught up recently in a bit of a furore around a letter published in The Listener by some senior academics at the University of Auckland, in which they argued against the validity of mātauranga Māori as a form of science. And so as a counterpoint to this, Dr. Rangi Mātāmoa, who speaks at length on the topic of matariki, he says in this quote, how he recognises that empirical science is really part of Indigenous cultures around the world. Now, while the letter is not the particular focal point of our discussion today, it has undeniably set the context for our talk. Another aspect that set the context for our talk is, as those of you who are engaged in the climate space and even outside of the climate space may know, the IPCC's report on whether or not we're able to stay within 1.5 degrees was released yesterday. And so we have these two conversations going on and guiding our discussion, one in which we're very aware of the severity of needing to act upon climate change, and the other in which we're kind of considering ourselves, reflecting upon where is the space for Indigenous knowledges in this conversation, and how does that connect to climate change? Now, when we think about the letter and the listener, what it sort of highlights is the ways in which these Indigenous knowledges and their perspectives on climate change can remain marginalized within science. And this is also the case within the discipline of psychology. Today, I speak not really about mātauranga Māori, but of Indigenous knowledges more generally and with a lens on the Pacific. As a Palangi person with British ancestry, I also stand here in this conversation as a supporter of Pacific peoples in Aotearoa and abroad, including those with whom I work closely in my research. So today's outline. So today's lecture is going to take us on a bit of a journey, and we'll be going through history and around the world. I will begin by offering a brief history and summary of Eurocentrism and the Eurocentric South within psychology. And then I'll shift to talk about other ways of viewing the South, which I tend to be more relational and interconnected, taking community and Pacific psychologies as an example. Then finally, I'll contextualize this discussion by shifting our focus to climate mobility, which is the topic of my PhD research. And then to close, we'll kind of have some closing remarks about where this might leave us in relation to the letter. So we begin our conversation with an exploration of the Eurocentric South. Now, as someone with British ancestry, in fact, these are my ancestors I'm pointing to the screen, but you cannot see it, of course. You've got my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather seated on kind of in the middle, slightly to the left. Standing behind him is my great-great-grandmother, and the other older person seated on the right is my great-great-great-grandfather. And this is in their house in Christchurch in kind of the 1880s-ish. So with these ancestors having come to Aotearoa from England, I too have inherited a sort of European or British perspective of the world, in the same way that I have inherited others of their cultural values. What is culture? Well, we can't really talk about the influence of European culture in society without first defining these terms. Culture, as you see from the quote on the slide, includes ideals, values, and assumptions about life. And those assumptions guide behaviors and actions. And as you see at the end of the quote there, these assumptions are not necessarily obvious. So in many ways, what might be seen to be just standard practice within European culture or within Eurocentric psych is not necessarily particularly obvious. Culture and psychology often get mixed up together, but they are actually distinct. So as we see from the quote about society, whilst people have culture, those people are organized within social structures, and those social structures make up society. So we have culture and society, which are interwoven, but yet also distinct. So we're keeping that in mind as we do our tour of the world. So now we're going to think about the origin of the Eurocentric South. For a long time, for a long history, there has been ancient interest in the social character of human beings, of social and cultural relations and the sort of links between people and society. There's evidence of this ancient interest within Greek, African, and Indian societies. However, this ancient thought has also been discovered within Indigenous groups, often from the global south. However, it's just less widely known, and I'll talk about that later. This ancient study of science was more interested in the nature of our existence, or of metaphysics. So metaphysics is essentially, what do you know? What is truth? What is real? And we see this definition here of metaphysics, which basically says, that metaphysics is concerned with the fundamental nature of reality and being, and that includes ontology, cosmology, and often epistemology. All of these ologies can be confusing if you're not someone who's immersed in philosophy of science. So I'll just quickly define some of these. Now, cosmology, as many of us know, is the nature of the universe, and that often includes spiritualities as well. But the two that I always get mixed up myself, and I'm sure there are others who get them muddled in their heads too, are ontology and epistemology. These slippery terms are related, but also different. So ontology is the study of what is. In other words, what is actually knowledge and what counts as something that we can know. And then epistemology refers more to the nature of knowledge and different methods of gaining knowledge. So that can include your methods, that can include what we come to understand as standard scientific practice. So the Eurocentric South, or psychology, also has this sort of shorter history when it starts to emerge as a discipline. So the psychology that we think of today has a relatively short history compared to what we were talking about earlier, beginning around the time of industrialization. The discipline of psychology is typically attributed to Europe and North America, dating from the 1880s, around the same time that those ancestors that we saw before arrived here in Aotearoa, with Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, who's the lovely bearded man we see in the picture. And he's widely regarded as the father of experimental psychology. He was the first to call himself a psychologist. We also see William James from the United States, who's known as the father of American psychology and who sort of popularized psychology in the United States. However, beyond these two bearded men, and I didn't pick up a picture of William James, but you can assume similar spectacled, lovely grey beard. Beyond that, we've also had other psychologists, which were just not named as such. So there's Al-Farabi, who was around from 1870 to 950. I think that's actually supposed to be BC. I didn't include that, my apologies. So he's one of the major thinkers in Islamic philosophy, and he wrote Social Psychology and the Principle of the Opinions of the Citizens of the Virtuous City. Quite the mouthful. And this was one of the first treatises to deal with social psychology. Social psychology is the study of social interactions and how they impact upon people. And it developed in Europe and the US as the discipline we know today, alongside industrialization, urbanization, and this fear that those who were trying to manage these different industries had about revolt amongst overworked laborers. And so there was the sense that we need to come to understand human behavior so that we can therefore control it. So we've seen so far, there's this long history and there's this short history. The short history is very heavily interwoven with industrialization, as I mentioned. What happened during industrialization that created this shift was the mass migration of people to urban centers, or urbanization, to work in these booming industries, like in the weaving industry, as we see in the picture here. And it wasn't a particularly nice place to work, especially if you were from the lower working class. According to the 20th century philosopher Simmel, life in the city compelled a reduction of qualitative values to quantitative measures, a numerical sum as expressed by monetary value. Social connections and cultural ways of being became less important to maintain your job or position in society, such as your precarious role in the weaving shed, which is again shown in this image. Many of these things were defined by money rather than their inherent value. So consequently, this way of life, which formerly relied upon community bonds and the extended family unit, was replaced by a system of monetary exchange. And this fundamentally reframed the ways that people perceive the world and each other. It rearranged the nature of social relations. When we think about psychology, this shift in social relations left a lasting impact upon how we study people's behavior, how we study those social relations. Around the time of industrialization, there was a movement away from metaphysics, that is the nature of existence, towards that which can be objectively measured to exist. Metaphysics was said to be immeasurable, therefore not valid form of knowledge. So this philosophy of science, leaning upon what was objectively measurable, was grounded in logical positivism. So logical positivism is an approach to science which aims to be as close to natural science as possible. And in the quote, we see that it's characterized by the view that scientific knowledge is the only kind of factual knowledge, and that all traditional metaphysical doctrines are to be rejected as meaningless. The critical part of this particular definition here is that the ultimate basis of knowledge depends upon public experimental verification or confirmation rather than upon personal experience. That is, we have to be able to prove it publicly rather than just our own personal experiences for it to be counted as a valid form of knowledge. What this meant for science is that science began to only recognize that which can be capable of logical proof or scientific verification. Now, naturally, issues of ethics, of metaphysics, of ontology, again, what is knowledge, were separated from what it means to do science. And this had a conceptualization on being. From a logical positivist perspective, the self was constructed through this logical positivist analysis into separate measurable components, only those which were able to be visible, able to be observed. And this was separate from cultural and social worlds. Now, this shift in philosophical mood naturally was spread around the world through the processes of colonization. The philosophical shift on what it meant to be was absorbed as an underlying assumption within the emerging discipline of psychology. And as these perspectives on psychology traveled around the world with the scientists who were traveling around the world through the processes of colonization, this meant that those particular perspectives were spread and in many cases adopted within the structures of science within the nations that were colonized. We see in this political map of the world that there's a lot of blue, particularly when we think about the continent of Africa. And that's because many of the prolific colonizers, such as France and England, did have a lot of blue and a lot of red in their flags. However, contemporary political maps tend to be a lot more colorful. So in the year 2000, this is what the political map looks like. And we see that Africa is much more colorful. A lot of these countries have now independent rule and are no longer underneath colonization. However, these positivist perspectives on science continue to dominate, even though the amount of the world that Europe, or in particular England and the United States, had dominion over has reduced. The threads of this perspective of psychology remain. And here in Aotearoa, we're still blue. Our global psychology remains constructed on the foundations of this Anglo-American perspective. When I say Eurocentric psychology, what do I actually mean? Well, it might be summarized through Descartes' perspective, I think, therefore I am. That is, it looks at an individual. It's a singular approach, and it's assumed to be upheld all around the world. In particular, it's ethnocentric, so it focuses on Anglo-American culture to the exclusion of other cultural perspectives. It's weird. Many of you might have heard of this before, but WEIRD is an acronym that was created by Heinrich et al. And it's now one of the most cited papers in psychology, where they kind of posit that people who are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic formed the basis of 90% of research within the discipline of psychology. So while people who are weird and from weird societies dominate research, they don't necessarily, in fact, they don't make up majority of the world. In these weird societies, sense of self is oriented towards individualism. That is, we tend to put focus on individual success rather than what can be done for the gains of the collective. Whereas in collectivist societies, social support is necessary to being part of life, and also the individual is situated within the society, all working together to move the people group forward. This perspective, this individualistic approach, is also reductionistic, as it's studied separate from its context, separate from society, separate from spiritualities and from humanity. So we see how the totality of human experience, all of the different parts that we encounter, including our own personal experiences, which cannot be measured, are reduced to only that which can be measured, a single measurable problem of what it means to be the self. Of interest for this group in particular is that this perspective of the self is aspiritual. As Pita King, a Māori psychologist from the University of Massey, says, disciplines like psychology have become more concerned with what humans are made of in the physical sense than what makes us human in the existential sense. And so we're focused a lot more on, for example, particular structures in the brain rather than how we relate to one another in society. This approach to psychology has meant only those elements of the self which are observable are permitted in the majority of the discipline. And this is often to the exclusion of indigenous approaches, which I will talk about later. This has also meant that studies of spirituality in the abstract tend to be marginalized or viewed as not scientific. But as many people in this room or on the Zoom call likely understand, spirituality can be an integral aspect of the ways that we understand ourselves, of our self-construal, as well as our daily experiences. In the same way, for many Māori, wairuatanga, that is spirituality, is not separate from the realm of existence, but experienced through everyday social and cultural practices. It's all part of it. So that takes us to considering other approaches to the self, the relational self. So far, we've seen how our cultural perspectives on the self and knowledge can inform how we see and come to understand the world around us. When we think about this, it's quite clear that this infamous letter in defense of science is actually in defense of the dominance of Eurocentric science. By asserting that Mātauranga Māori is not science, it's reflecting these assumptions of positivist logic, that only that which is measurable counts, and of universalism, that this perspective of science, which has come from European countries, is the perspective of science or of the self, which is reliable and relatable all around the world. We also see a mistrust of spirituality and a disconnection from culture and society. And so by doing this, the letter sort of reinforces these biased assumptions about the validity of other relational, connected and situated ways of viewing the world. And I'll outline a few of these in the next section. A lot of these have emerged in the last sort of 50 years ago or so, as there's been recent recognition about the ways in which culture, context, society, and behavior are fundamentally interconnected. We're not able to separate them and reduce them. For myself, having European ancestry, had I not engaged with these approaches through my own interest in this particular topic, which I'll talk about, I too could have also held on to this individualized, isolated perspective, which would have been passed down through my European ancestors' cultural traditions. So in the next section, we'll talk about these relational perspectives and how they offer sort of fresh, liberative ways of viewing well-being, which draw us back into connection with our society, with our culture, and with our environments. First of all, we'll talk about community psychology. So I would define myself as a community psychologist. Community psychologists, the discipline of community psychology is that which arose from a dissatisfaction with the dominance of Eurocentric psychology. What it was particularly frustrated with was the ways in which well-being was reduced to the individual level, failing to engage with societal determinants of well-being. But in many ways, the political structures play out on the personal. Social conditions, while economically and politically derived, which is our macro level seen in the diagram there, can shape community functioning, which is our meso level, and in turn, this can inform personal character, learning, mental and physical health. Community psychology, instead of focusing on the micro level, shifts the focus upwards towards the meso level and towards the macro level, taking on a broader view of people and a broader view of interpersonal relations, which seek to see people and their feelings, thoughts, and actions within a social context. Another critical component of community psychology is that it also seeks transformative change. And this is through political action, through policy change, as well as just working with communities to look at what structures are in place that hinder their flourishing. So, for example, and I use the example of the RSE scheme, the Recognised Seasonal Workers, as this relates to the topics I'll be talking about shortly in relation to climate mobility. So over the last year with COVID, there were many reports of the high mental health burdens that seasonal workers experienced from being stuck in New Zealand. Some of these workers had come over as part of the Recognised Seasonal Employer Scheme, RSE scheme, during which, or as part of which, it's really important to maintain your job, otherwise you risk being deported. However, some of them were trapped here by the border closures because they had lost their job. However, they were unable to return back to their home countries. And in many instances, they were unable to obtain new employment. So applying our community psychologists' focus on well-being, at the individual level, we can see how the stress of being separated from your loved ones and this sort of sense of uncertain future can contribute to personal mental health burdens, perhaps depressive symptoms and high levels of anxiety. But if we look at the reasons that those behaviors or experiences might be happening, we shift our eye up to the meso level. We can examine how having annual rhythms disrupted by being trapped in Aotearoa. Typically, people who are part of the scheme will spend 7 months here and then the rest of the year with their family. However, they're stuck here for a longer period of time. Or the ways in which they may have to live without income and thus become reliant upon their employer who's supposed to provide accommodation and food. And how this can expose employees to exploitation. So I direct your attention to the quote. This is a quote from an employer, and I think it was a kiwi fruit orchard. Essentially, the story behind here was that there was a couple one man who was working as an RSE worker, and because of his particular role, he was required to be there for a certain period of time, but his wife was living in another part of the country, and his employer was not letting him spend his weekends away to go and visit her. His employer was forcing him to work here over the weekend. Because of the precarity of the role, he's required to remain there by his boss. And so he can be exposed to exploitation as his boss recognizes that his position here in New Zealand is really dependent upon the fact that he keeps showing up, regardless of what's going on in his personal life. And then if we go up a level, at the macro level, we can see how the requirements of the RSE scheme and these border closures can construct settings in which workers are open to exploitation. The particular fixed period of the RSE scheme and the fact that New Zealand was slow to open up to the Pacific because of COVID has meant that this situation was experienced by a lot of people. If we think about the transformative change perspective of psychology, if we understand the interactions between these multiple layers, we can advocate for immigration policy change to ensure that migrant workers are able to return home, or are aware of their rights, or are less open or subject to exploitation in the workplace. So in other words, we need to understand the problem, we need to understand societal structures, we need to understand the particular workplace culture in order to resolve the problems that people are experiencing. This dissatisfaction with Eurocentric psychology and its individual approach also sparked a decolonizing movement within psychology. So in contrast to Descartes, Indigenous psychology's perspectives of the South are inherently relational. They might be considered as we communicate, therein we are created. That is, communication and the understanding of the South is culturally and socially constructed. Indigenous psychologies emerged in the late 60s and early 70s alongside global decolonizing movements as an attempt to decenter the dominance of these weird psychologies, or these weird approaches to science, and to repluralize the discipline to account for the diversity of human experience. It wasn't a direct attempt to reject these more Western science or positivist science approaches, but rather to challenge this reading of behavior which privileges the subjective, distant, assumed universally relevant approach of understanding knowledge and its production. And this process of decolonizing psychology is done by the Māori and Pacific Psychology Research Group, which is the image shown here at our university. And shout out to my friend Logan, who is smiling there very happily. So very stoked to be shouted a cup of coffee by the photographer. Indigenous psychologies could be defined as this, and I'll let you read that, but a key thing to draw out from this description is that Indigenous psychologies are a method which emphasize specific Indigenous ontologies of ways of knowing or being, which allow for the cultural context, and that is often tied to a specific Indigenous people group. So it doesn't assume universalism, but takes into account cultural values, ways of viewing the world, and interconnectedness between one another. A subset of Indigenous psychologies, and that which I tend to work in, are Pacific psychologies. Pacific psychologies are Pacific-focused ways of viewing the world, in which understanding of the South and well-being are really taken from the Pacific worldview, in which we look at the ways that the South is situated in relation to others, and also the value of the environment in that relationship. The South is not viewed as independent, but rather situated in interdependent community, like the stone sitting at the top, everybody working together to support one another. Actions are not considered for individual gain, but rather for how it will influence the collective. And the collective includes family, extended family, and broader community. This view of well-being is also quite holistic. So in the same way the South is constructed in community, well-being is constructed in community. It requires a harmonious balance between family, spiritual worlds, social life, physical health, economic structures, and cultural value systems. And this could be understood through a whale, a Samoan house, in which all po are required, or po posts are required to hold the structure together. This holistic understanding of the South and of well-being was the foundation of this whānau model of health and well-being. And some of you who work in the health sector might be familiar with it. The whānau model of health is a well-recognized model for symbolizing the ways in which Pacific well-being is interconnected with all aspects of life. What we see is that physical or mental experiences of health are embedded within community and social systems. The roof of the whale is culture, that which protects. The foundation of the whale is family, an aspect of well-being which is one's grounding or a place to stand. The 4 po or poles of the whale relate to spiritual, physical, mental, and other forms of health, and other there includes economic status, sexuality, gender, etc. Of particular note to our discussion is that while these components have been made distinct, the model also recognizes the interdependence of each aspect upon the others. In other words, if you shift one, that could destabilize the whole structure. Furthermore, surrounding the whale are context, our time, and our environment, and that indicates the contextual nature of well-being in which societal structures can have a bearing on the self or the collective self in that particular perspective. As a specific example, these sort of structured relations that we saw through the whānau model can be reflected through a Kiribati understanding of well-being, te miuroi. So the value placed upon interconnectedness and community within Pacific Psychologies is seen through this particular model. This is a Kiribati conceptual framework called te butuken te miuroi, meaning the supporting beams or structures for uplifting or enhancing well-being. We can see here, if you look to the right of the diagram with the nested circles, the process for achieving te miuroi, which is the good life, and it also can mean well-being. Te miuroi is achieved through interdependent Kiribati values, and it involves processes of respect, of acknowledging Kiribati custom, of self-reliance on the environment and also on one another, and having a healthy environment. And all of that is informed by family and by customary governance, te utu and te maneaba. You have to remain in harmony and respectful relationship with these different structures in order to achieve te miuroi. So when we think about climate change and the ways in which people in Kiribati may be exposed to environmental change, you can see that remaining in harmony with the environment or not being able to do so through environmental change can disrupt all of these processes for living the good life or achieving te miuroi. Why is that particularly pertinent? Well, for many Kiribati people, land is also a way of understanding people. The word te aba means both the land and the people simultaneously. There's a critical ontological unity. When speaking of land, one does not say awaba, meaning my land, but abau, meaning me land. And so this links people in psychic ways to each other, to their ancestors, to their history, and to their physical environment. Land is the basis for relationality and for knowing and being. So land is very serious. Land can be part of what it means to be, or what it can be to understand the self. They're connected to others, but also connected to the environment. And this leads us to consider climate-related mobility and what that means when we think about well-being. So far, what we've seen is that staying in harmony with the land is very important, and connectedness to the land can inform well-being. We also see that Eurocentric psychology, in its separation of oneself from culture and society, wouldn't really apply when working with people for whom the environment is part of their self-concept, and for whom well-being is informed by socio-political issues. In fact, that's most of us, but that's particularly pertinent when we consider climate change. The implications of climate-related mobility for frontline peoples, like this Tuvaluan boy who's shown in the image walking through a flood that swept over the island, they also sit within cultural contexts and political structures. Climate change experiences are a consequence of inaction on climate, on reducing emissions. And in the same way, the way that people experience the consequences of that inaction are culturally contextualized. So therefore, our assumption of the next section is that any exploration of the impacts of climate change on people who move in the context of climate change must look beyond Eurocentric, reductionistic, positivist, and individualized approaches and take into account this relationality and contextual nature of being. Before we get into well-being, just to sort of lay a bit of groundwork about what I mean by climate mobility. So climate change is undoubtedly an environmental issue. It's a physical issue. There are anticipated severe impacts in the Pacific, and the IPCC report released yesterday outlined how essentially we have a very narrow time frame to keep warming within 1.5 degrees, without which it's very likely that many low-lying Pacific atoll islands will disappear, such as Tuvalu and Kiribati. Our image shows a king tide that swept over an atoll, the atoll of Whanawhiti in Tuvalu a couple of years ago. Other predictions, and I'm not going to go into detail because it's very doom and gloom, and we're talking about well-being, not anxiety. But yeah, there are other concerns around stronger waves, tidal surges, coastal erosion, rising temperatures, and the indirect effects of these, like the ways in which livelihoods can be destroyed, food sources can become no longer secure, and also people's physical health can be impacted by consuming food or water which has become contaminated. So that's the negatives. However, many Pacific peoples refuse to accept this negative narrative. Rather, they say, we are not drowning, we are fighting. As a consequence, some people are viewing migration as a form of adaptation. And this is in response to the reality of the threat and the severity of predictions. That is, some people might be seeing that even though they don't want to leave their homelands, they could adopt a kind of preemptive approach in which they maintain their autonomy over their choice and decide when, where, and how to move. However, this has been widely critiqued. This response doesn't tend to recognize that this is a choice within constraints. Most people actually prefer to remain on their homeland to sustain these legacies of culture, of language, and of that connectedness to land that we talked about earlier. So migrating is really a last resort in that sense and can't be considered fully autonomous because people are forced to make these choices. It also emphasizes island vulnerabilities over strengths. So really foregrounds the ways in which these people groups are exposed disproportionately over others, rather than the natural resilience and the natural strengths that can be drawn from their cultural practices. It positions exposed communities as responsible for adapting to the problem. That is, the communities are the ones who have said that they have to do the adaptation, rather than shifting that responsibility to major emitting nations to seek political solutions and reduce their own emissions. However, even with this taken into account, it's likely that some people will need to migrate. And so we need to think about the ways in that this migration can adopt that strength-based approach and the ways in which existing structures can influence well-being and how we can improve that. In order for us to do that, we need to understand what it actually means to migrate in the context of climate change. And here I tend to refer to mobility more than migration, because it's hard to sort of delineate climate-related mobility from other forms of migration. Often, migration in the context of climate change is an interconnected product of social, political, economic, and environmental factors. For example, people in Besio, which is in Kiribati, may move here to Aotearoa to perhaps work through the RSE scheme, but perhaps they are unable to find work on their home island of Besio because of overcrowding, and that overcrowding can come through people leaving outer islands where subsistence-based livelihoods are no longer viable because perhaps their swamp taro is being flooded by frequent overtopping of waves. And so they might move to Besio and be unable to find stable employment, be more prompted to consider options elsewhere. And they might see in Aotearoa, not only do we have jobs available, but we have education which they could access. And some people also want to move to be reunited with their families. So everything is connected. whilst it might appear primarily economically motivated and voluntary, it is again within a situation of limited choice. However, migration is not the only option. A lot of people are likely to move within other islands or within the region, so from Kiribati to Fiji, for example. Others might choose to stay and advocate for climate action, or may actually be unable to leave because of lack of material resources, such as sufficient funds to pay the exorbitant fees to come to New Zealand. And that's around $5,000, I think, to come from Kiribati to Aotearoa. And so to capture all of these different experiences, I refer to climate mobility. When we think about mobility, and here it's actually referred to as migration with dignity, is the fact that there are currently no legal frameworks which exist to protect people who move for climate-related reasons. So-called climate refugees, which many of you may have heard, do not actually exist. They're not protected by any international refugee law. In response to such legal gaps, in 2014, the former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong, who's shown in our picture here, developed the Migration with Dignity framework, which provided vocational training to enable migration through existing immigration pathways and to neighbouring states like here in Aotearoa, with their dignity and with their strength and with their well-being intact. Kiribati's focus has now shifted towards adaptation on the island, recognising that most people don't want to leave their ancestral lands. But what this means for people from Kiribati who choose to leave is that they must do so on an individual basis without formal government support. When we're looking at this whole process of climate mobility, it's important to look at the ways it's previously been understood or approached. So we've seen so far that climate mobility is complex and that there's very few immigration options available to people. Understanding the implications on well-being of these different structures has tended to adopt a Eurocentric approach to date. From this Eurocentric or reductionistic view, the impacts of climate change on well-being have been individualized to the singular person and assumed that that particular experience, which has been perhaps predicted from an experiment, is likely to be universal. This reproduction of Eurocentrism is seen in contemporary climate change science, and this systematically marginalizes Indigenous and relational ways of understanding climate change. Furthermore, it ignores how well-being is informed by those macro-level structures, by immigration policy, or in our case, the lack thereof, of the ongoing impacts of colonisation in the Pacific, of the racist nature of climate inaction that nations like Kiribati are likely to go underwater, and of course, of global inaction on climate change. And so we cannot address the well-being impacts of climate mobility unless we also address the inequities at the heart of the climate crisis, and unless we also take into account each people group's own way of understanding what it means to be well. As an example of this individualization, we can think about individual psychopathology. So that's our mental health diagnoses that you may often hear about. For example, there's been found that there is an association between experiencing extreme weather events and a range of mental health illnesses such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, depressive disorders. Psychologists have also coined terms for an array of new mental health issues, such as eco-grief, eco-anxiety, or solastalgia. So solastalgia is what our polar bear is experiencing here. And this is the feeling of a profound sense of loss and connection, loss of connection and detachment from the environment following dislocation from place or home. We could think of it as like thinking about where you grew up, perhaps it was by the sea, and then considering that with sea level rise, it may not be there forever. That sense of nostalgia for your childhood, but reflecting on the fact that that solace might not be there in the future. However, I was quite amused when I looked up an image for solastalgia, because this was the image that came up. This is a quintessentially individualistic approach to well-being. It's a single polar bear encountering climate impacts alone. Polar bears don't live in families, don't live in communities, but people are not like polar bears. We are embedded in communities, families, and societies, and we can lean upon others when we are going through such experiences. This approach has implications for the study of Pacific well-being in the context of climate mobility. Interconnected Pacific perspectives to date have not really been reflected in discussions by academics, many of whom come from European countries, when they talk about climate change in the Pacific. Like climate change, research tends to focus on physical impacts, like on physical health or on mental well-being, and takes this individualized approach with the impact of environmental hazards, rather than exploring the ways in which people are interconnected with land and interconnected with all elements of life, as well as for whole communities. It also doesn't really take into account these societal determinants of well-being, the ways in which global inaction on climate change and restrictions on climate mobility, that is the migration without dignity, can impact people's ability to really live well, to live through their strengths, whether they're living on their island or whether they've chosen to migrate. Like for the Tuvaluan communities living here in Aotearoa is the image on the right. So for us here, as a large wealthy nation, we're likely to host future climate migrants. And it's important for us to understand how traversing our immigration system can impact Tuvaluan and Kiribati well-being. And this is the focus of my own research, which I'm just going to share about briefly. The Tuvaluan and Kiribati communities have diverse experiences, but there are sort of shared threads that run across them. And these quotes I'm about to show come from a series of talanoa or casual conversations that I had over the last year around what it means to migrate in the context of climate change. So one of these shared threads is the process of navigating immigration obstacles. Needing to get around all of these different barriers to successful resettlement can create a toll for Pacific communities. And Emery outlines these particular reasons. And I'll draw your attention to a few things. The fixedness of the break, the fact that she didn't really understand this different construction on time as having firm boundaries, the lack of choice within the workplace, and the need to really work hard and work within the bounds of her job, because otherwise she might lose the job, and that could have a bearing on her own health, on her community, or for others that don't have such a permanent visa, they might risk being deported. So what Emery shows us is that the political plays out again on the personal from that community psychology perspective. Strict labour mobility requirements like the RSE scheme and the callousness of the workplace settings in Aotearoa, in contrast to how she's used to living in Kiribati, can have little grace for cultural differences, or can create a lot of stress, which can disproportionately burden people working under those settings, not just for the individual, but for the whole community who are collectively trying to get through these different situations. Oh, I think I skipped one. Yeah, regrowing roots. Apologies if I shifted that too soon. So, although people can experience adversity, they actually do so in community and not just as individuals. So this was another thread that came out through our discussions. Unlike our polar bear going through solastalgia, people carry their identities and cultures with them as a community, and they can regrow their roots from the seeds of these identities and cultures in the host nation here in Aotearoa. This can provide a buffer against the adversity created within current immigration systems. So Emery's quote here, talking about the value of living in a community way, highlights how when we come together, when we gather And when she can draw upon te kateine Kiribati, which is Kiribati custom, or the Kiribati language, this can create te muroi, that is that sense of well-being or the good life, living in a harmonious way, in a harmonious, respectful balance with family, with community, and within the Kiribati Maneba governance structures. Relating that back to our discussion, we see that this Eurocentric approach of the individual wouldn't really fully capture and explain the experiences of Kiribati communities who are migrating in the context of climate change, because we need to take into account what it means for people from Kiribati to experience well-being te muroi from a Kiribati perspective. It also means we need to take into account how the political systems play out on personal well-being and how they sit alongside one another. The cultural approach and the societal approach are interconnected. In other words, experiences of migration within these systems in the context of climate change rely upon cultural specific conceptions of well-being rather than this Eurocentric approach, which has tended to dominate so far. And so what we see is that we really do need to think beyond Eurocentrism when we're considering climate-related mobility. And that sort of brings us to the end of our discussion today with a few final points. Our letter has invoked us to think more deeply about what it means to do science, and that has taken us on a journey around the globe. We've taken a tour through history in Europe. We've observed how the Eurocentric psychology, which arose as a product of industrialization, reduced what it meant to be down to only that which was observable. We then explored new horizons, engaging with alternatives to reductionistic perspectives on the self and on well-being, which included community, Indigenous, and Pacific perspectives, which are useful tools for engaging with diverse societies. Upon which shores do we land now? Well, coming back to the letter, when we defend science, it's important to ask what science are we defending? Because not all science holds the same assumptions and not all science is applicable for the same people. Our tour of psychology has demonstrated that there are diverse ways of understanding human experiences and behavior, many of which derive from different cultural traditions which don't have links back to Europe. Just as different groups have unique ways of understanding the world and the nature of existence or ontology, so too does science possess diverse ways to come to understand and observe and describe these experiences. However, whichever paradigm or approach we choose when we do science must suit the context of the people that we're working with. As scientists or people who are interested in science, we could consider being open to engaging with knowledge traditions which align with the people that we work with, rather than trying to sort of squeeze their experiences into a square box, the square form of science, which is not necessarily created for them. When we think about this in relation to climate mobility, this square box, this Eurocentric view of viewing well-being as just the individual, can't really capture Pacific communities' lived experiences of climate mobility, which relate to the way that they perceive the environment, one another, and the value and place of culture. However, we don't need to fully throw out the baby with the bathwater. As scientists or science lovers, we can choose to hold a space for dialogical pluralism. That is, we can engage with multiple different ways of knowing and of coming to know, depending on what is required by the question that we ask. Eurocentrism can sort of exist in conversation with more diverse methods. These individualistic approaches can offer good tools, like when we think about solastalgia, that's a very valid experience that people go through. And when we want to understand perhaps the rate of mental health burdens amongst communities who migrate, it's good to have a statistic. So we can hold these Eurocentric approaches, but we don't need to fully reject more culturally appropriate relational approaches either. Each holds value, each holds merit, and each is a form of science informed by its own perspective of observations in the environment about what it means to actually come to know. So I'd like to finish our talk today with this quote from Jonathan Ferrier. Go. He's an indigenous scientist, and he says, Indigenous people are very scientific. It's just that our science includes the heart. Nō reira, kua motu taku kōrero I tēnei pō. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Olivia. You've given us a wonderful tour. Is your voice going to hold up for a few questions?
Yep, I've probably got enough voice and energy for another 10 minutes, perhaps. I'm just going to take a glass of water.
Online, you can just either put your question in the chat, or you can shake your hand and I'll see you. And people here, you can just put your hand up and ask a question. They're all looking a bit shocked.
Yeah, there's a lot of content, so thanks for listening.
That takes people a while to think of great questions. Question? Yes, John. This is John.
Just asking about, say, your description of European psychology and so on. It seemed to me to be a bit narrow in terms of what's actually gone on in European psychology. I mean, it's comparatively recent. Now, you do get people like Wundt and so on, and James, who head along a very experimental sort of line, but surely there's other approaches, which are dialogical centered and which are family centered. We've got social psychology, all that kind of thing. So I just wondered about this very sharp either or that you seem to be putting up.
Yeah, thank you for your question there. And that's a really good point. Whilst there is this really sort of individualistic experimental approach within European psychology, there is the continental traditions, which you raised, which do take into account family systems and the structures that we find ourselves in, etc. However, it's kind of the emphasis that I've put there on this individual and measurable approach is because of the ways that that particular perspective has still sort of kept its roots in the way that we understand psychology. There is this middle space. Many Indigenous approaches are sort of in conversation with these more dialogical perspectives and those which build theory from the ground up rather than just through an experiment in a laboratory. Yeah, but the legacy of that still sort of has its fingers in psychology. And so we see people mistrusting these other more relational ways of viewing the self or psychology.
Ruth's got a question.
Yes, I suppose my question is a bit like John's, and it's about the polarization. And I think the current debate that one of my close ex-colleagues was involved in starting off polarizes Western science versus Maori. And there are critiques within Western philosophy of an individualistic view. And I've just been reading a feminist theologian who muttered about Descartes. He should have said, "My mother bore me, therefore I exist." That he totally takes himself out of his context and imagines himself without mother, without context, just existing as a mind. So, I mean, that doesn't build a psychology for the modern world, but it is a kind of critique from within. And the other one, I used to work with a department that must have been one of the last strongholds of Marxism in the Southern Hemisphere. And I mean, one of the great books in that tradition is about what they call possessive individualism. And they see it as rising with capitalism. And so individualism is about a political system. So I think, I used to get stood up to represent Western science against Pacific knowledge in a course I had to teach. And I really resented having been regarded as a representative of Western science because I didn't always agree with its assumptions. And I think you obviously can't, in your thesis, deal with the whole history of Western philosophy. But I do think it's quite important to recognise that it's a particular sort of Western philosophy, and it ought not to be counted as the only thing that all Westerners believe.
Hmm.
They don't. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm not answering that question. It's a speech. Sorry.
Yeah, and you're right. Like there is a lot of this grey space. Not all Western philosophy of science is the same. And when I mean Eurocentric, what I was referring to are those particular elements which is reductionistic and focus on the individual and tends to be more ethnocentric, universalizing, etc. But not every approach has the same. As I mentioned, I'm a community psychologist, and that also can be a Western way of understanding psychology. Everything sort of has its own different, what am I trying to say? Yeah, they're in conversation with each other. But yeah, the stronghold of what it means to do science is still very much present. And just because we might have ancestry that links back to Europe doesn't necessarily mean that we uphold that particular understanding of Western science. Yeah.
Anyone online want to say anything? Put your question in the chat. Yes, TT.
I'm just curious about one of the quotes on your slides. The author was Liu. Is that a Chinese psychologist?
Yes. Now, where was that? James Liu is a Chinese psychologist. Where are we?
So it's a statement like originating from Eastern philosophy.
Yeah, so there's a whole Eastern philosophical tradition around psychology. James Liu himself does Confucian psychology. So he looks at the ways in which human-heartedness, like what his understanding of what it means to exist, informs psychology more generally. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Asian psychological traditions and Asian indigenous psychologies are also quite diverse as well, in the same way that different indigenous traditions are diverse. And also, as was said earlier, even Western approaches are quite diverse. But his own particular approach looks at the Chinese tradition and the place of Confucianism. Yeah, sorry, that wasn't really an answer to the question. It was just more information, but yeah.
Can I ask you, Olivia, which you think, how you think the Bible fits into all of this? Do you think a Eurocentric vision or a post-colonial vision is truer to a biblical worldview?
I think that's a really tricky question to answer, because the Bible was clearly written before we developed this way of understanding science as this sort of hypothetico-deductive method. But many of the people who would have been around in biblical societies, no doubt, still came to understand the world around them through observation, and by making, through those observations, developed what it means to know, or developed knowledge. And so I'd say we've got, the kind of the both, the understanding of what we see and forming that into what it means to do knowledge for particular people in particular settings. But I think also in biblical times, they would have held this more relational, collectivistic approach. And so there's space for that conversation. Because, especially when we think about the Bible, like spirituality and faith is obviously one of the fundamental tenets of why the Bible exists, because we believe that there is a God. And so an approach which distrusts anything that considers what it means to exist, why we exist, where our existence has come from, would then undermine why we have the Bible in the first place. That's a really good question, though. I'll think about that some more.
Yes, I have another question, which is a communitarian approach isn't always consistent with well-being, is it? Because sometimes you can get stuck in communities that are very oppressive. For example, the mafia, you know, if you try getting out of it, it'd be rather difficult. And there are lots of examples like that as well.
So is your question like...
I mean, you're associating the sort of community approach and reflects, you know, the relational approach as always sort of being associated with well-being, or a different way of understanding well-being. Very often that can actually as well.
A community psychology approach, and like if we take the example of the mafia, for example, wouldn't be about the person being amongst the mafia themselves and then looking at what the mafia's behaviors are, but rather what are the pathways that lead people to be part of the mafia. And if we don't want these sort of criminal behaviors to continue, then what can we do for the communities who are like the sources for people moving into that setting to ensure that they have other ways to find income or to support their families, etc. And so it ties together looking at this, I guess, sort of multiple ecological systems approach with trying to understand how we can actually change that system. Of course, there are also critiques about community psychology. Often it gets caught up in looking at just one community, like focusing on one particular geographical location, rather than taking into account the fact that that location is in a city and that city is in a country, etc. Yeah, but it's good and it's bad, essentially.
Okay, we'll have to talk more about that. Anyone in the room got any more questions? Because I think your voice is wearing.
I've probably got voice for like one more. Like I need to go take a long drink of water.
No, I don't think there is. So maybe we should finish it there, Olivia. So thank you so much again for doing this, despite us being sick and coming out on Zoom. So thank you so much.
No worries.
It was a wonderful introduction to our lecture. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone online for coming. It was wonderful to have you all.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Bye. Bye.
All right, have a lovely evening. Bye.